So, my name is Dr. Antonio Graceffo, and today we're going to talk about the development of the Chinese economy, and particularly we're going to talk about how it changed from 1978. So, as you know, People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. At that time, it was a planned economy, completely Marxist. For me, Marxist, communist, planned economy, it's all the same thing. Socialist, it's all the same thing for the purposes of economics. You know, if you study political science, you can have different ideas about that. But just the point is that the government owned controlled essentially every industry, factors of production, determined prices, determined employment, everything was determined by the government from 1949 until 1978. Now, one of the really interesting things, though, in my research was that, you won't believe this, but the Chinese economy actually grew by about 4% per year, even under Mao. Now, part of that, though, was probably because China was really poor to begin with, and they just come out of like 20 years of war, you know, because the Japanese, they'd already been fighting the Japanese before World War II even started, and through 1949, the end of the Civil War and all that. But it's pretty interesting, because I didn't expect to find that in my research, that the economy even grew under the communism. So 1978, Deng Xiaoping comes to power. One of the interesting things about Chinese politics is that in my country, and I would assume in Finland it's the same, that the roles that a politician has are assigned, and it's always the same. So for example, in the US, the Vice President of the United States is always the head of the Joint Chiefs, the head of the military committee, always. And in China, that's not the case. So sometimes you'll have a prime minister that holds these three offices, but not those two offices, or he holds these two, but not those three. So you get this guy, Deng Xiaoping, comes to power, and at times it's even unclear exactly what his title is, but he just kind of rules for about 20 years. And he's the guy who had all the ideas about changing the economy. So from 1978, they begin this economic transformation in China, and they start to privatize things. So this starts in a village where, when under the communism, they collectivized all the land. They basically said the land belongs to the village, belongs to the collective, and you farm whatever we tell you to farm, and you get ration coupons, and they didn't do very well. So there were these three farmers, these three men, and their families, of course, were a lot of people starving at this time, and these three men made a pact. They said, we're going to farm, we're going to do it our way, and we're going to increase the yield so that our families can eat better and help the village and whatever. And these three men made a pact that, because what they were doing was illegal, and they made an agreement that said, if one of us gets arrested, the other two will take care of the family of the other. And that's how this started. And the word of this got to a leader who said, maybe this is a good idea, and we'll start experimenting with that. So they started experimenting with what they called the household responsibility system. And what this meant was that each household was given a certain amount of production that they had to produce and sell to the state at the state price. But everything over that, they were allowed to keep. Suddenly, production just skyrocketed because people were able to keep some of it. So they did it in agriculture, and then they started doing it in the factories. You know, a factory has to produce this much, iron or whatever it was. And after you produce that much for the state, you can sell the other part. So that starts in 1978. 1980, 81, they start opening, Deng Xiaoping gets this idea to open the free trade area. And the first one, well, the most famous one is the one in Shenzhen Free Trade Area, and it's still there, you know, today. It's one of the most famous free trade areas in the world. And what's really interesting about that is that, so foreign companies couldn't really invest in China, and you couldn't really come here and open a company and things at that time. So they start experimenting, because they had the idea that there was knowledge outside of China that might help them, and economic ideas that might help them, but then they don't want to just open the floodgates, because when that happened before, their country was ripped out from under them. So they wanted to do it very slowly. So they said, you know what we'll do? We'll make this free trade area, we'll let foreigners come in here to trade, foreign companies, you know, but they only have to stay in this one area. And they allowed some very small village enterprises to start dealing with the foreigners. And so what was really interesting was that the big, massive state companies weren't the ones who dealt with the foreigners. It was these little villages. And so you wind up with It's really weird, like some little village of, a few 100,000 people, and suddenly he's the guy that's now dealing with foreign companies, and they're making the most money, and they became really important in the economy. So you had these, what they call state-owned enterprises, which means big state-owned companies. But then you had township and village enterprises. And actually in the early days, these were the ones who led the way to dealing with foreigners. Today, some of the companies that have been privatized, that are world-famous companies, actually started as township and village enterprises. And they were like some farmer running it. So I think that's kind of a neat thing. So they began through the 70s, through the 80s, began allowing a little bit more private enterprise. They did not make a law allowing private enterprise or even private ownership of anything until the 1990s. And that is just shocking, because by the 80s you already have private companies that are actually pretty big and starting to trade globally and things like that. Not until about 1992 did they even have the first private ownership laws and the first private company laws. The Chinese government makes these 5-year plans. And so right now we're in the 13th 5-year plan. And the way this works is that the Chinese president holds office for 10 years. He comes in during the final 2 years of the last 5-year plan. At the end of those 2 years, they feel like, okay, he's had enough experience now, and he makes one 5-year plan that he gets to see through to the end. And then he makes another plan that he hands off to the next president. So we're in the 13th 5-year plan now. So the 13th 5-year plan is significant because it's the one that actually Xi Jinping himself made and that he's going to see all the way to the end. So as these 5-year plans are coming out, in the 1990s, as you said, I think it was 92 or 94, and I forgot the number exactly of the 5-year plan, but it was the first one that recognized private enterprise as part of the socialist system. So they said that they used to have the 3 representatives, meaning the government represented like labor and agriculture and whatever it was, the army. And then eventually they said, oh yeah, we also represent entrepreneurs. And by just saying that, that sent a signal to the economy that it was okay to be an entrepreneur. And then they were officially recognized later in the late 90s and early 2000s. They started having official recognition. And even to the point of today of saying, you figure in the 1949, 1950, in the hardcore communism, if you said, I would like to earn a profit, or I would like to become wealthy, this was considered a bad thing. And then today, the message is, if you want to help the country and you want to be a good communist, you should become rich to help the country grow. And everything's just based on how much can we grow the GDP. So this happened all the way through, so that takes us through the 1990s. And then you got these state-owned enterprises. So it used to be that all the companies, effectively, all the companies were owned by the state. It actually isn't true that it was all. So it was only about 80 to 90%, but let's say almost all the companies were owned by the state. So little by little, through the 80s and 90s, it began not privatizing, but corporatizing. A lot of people get confused. They think privatizing means you give it or sell it to the public, but that's not really what happened. The first step was they corporatized. So if you went into like state shoe factory number 7, a long time ago, the guy running it might have been wearing a uniform, and he might have been a high-ranking party member, or he might have been a military or something like this. So then, as they started corporatizing, they actually they had a board of directors, they had a CEO, and then CEOs of successful companies they were in demand. So like other companies, and they start bidding for employees, and it starts turning into what for us is normal, in a country that has sort of, privatized economy, right? Capitalist economy. But this started happening even in the 80s, and they privatized these things. You got a CEO and you got managers and things like this. And then by the 90s, they start privatizing. And privatizing again didn't mean that they sold it to the public. It meant that they began selling some portion of it to the public. And all this time, when they had the corporate structure, the managers were able to keep some of the production. And instantly, because the managers could keep some of the production, they began cutting employment, because I don't know if any of you, can I ask how old you are?
29.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm the oldest by a million years. There used to be this thing in Europe called communism. I don't know if you read about it. so I worked in East Germany right after the Wiedervereinigung, right after the reunification of Germany, right? And so there were all these stories about how there'd be a little shop and it had like 200 employees. Because the shops didn't have to make a profit, and they had to provide jobs for the people. And so that's what China looked like. We call it overcapacity, but it just means a lot of people standing around doing nothing, and drawing a salary. As soon as they privatized, they said to or not even before they privatized, they just corporatized, they said to the manager, hey, you get to keep some of the money that you produce. Oh, okay, well I'm going to cut the employees by half. Anybody who's not essential, we're going to cut them and start making a profit. So that happens all through the 80s and 90s. And then when they start privatizing, it doesn't mean that they actually gave or sold the companies to the public. What they did was they made shares, they made them into corporations, they made shares, and they sold some of the shares to the public. Usually what happened was the managers wound up getting a bunch of shares at the beginning. So these early managers wound up owning big chunks of these companies without actually having to put any money in. Sir?
Did they actually fire employees? Could they even do that?
Yeah. Once they started corporatizing, they did. They began. But again, there's still massive overcapacity, and I'm sure that it was within strict government guidelines. I'm sure the government would not have allowed you to fire, 75% of the people. Because one of the issues with a social system like that is that if you fire people, basically what you're now doing is you're putting them on the government's payroll. The government has to give them assistance and things like that. So you're shifting your expense, from your factory to the government in order to make a profit. So that would be seen as a very, very bad thing to do. But they had some control of it. They were able to fire some people or move them to other factories. As we move into the 90s, we start privatizing, and then they also got the idea to reopen the stock exchange. So it reopened, I believe, in 1990, 1991, somewhere around there. They reopened the stock exchange. Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchanges both reopened. And companies that were owned by the government, they privatized them, which means they made shares. Well, if you have shares, then you can list on the stock exchange and sell them. So again, a lot of people don't understand about the Chinese economy. They think that because a company is being traded on, even on the New York Stock Exchange, doesn't mean the government doesn't own it. The government could still be 41% or 51% even owner of the company. What often happens today is that you have government owns X% of the shares, but then the other shares are owned by companies that are owned by the government or owned by someone from the, and you get these layers, and you really find out maybe just like 30% of the companies being traded, actively traded on the markets. I find that really interesting. It's just like hybrid. So a lot of people compare China to Russia, and how they made transformations. Of course, in Russia is now held up as an example of how not to do the transition. If you wanted to totally screw up your country, you follow the Russian model. The Chinese model is really good. Vietnam is following sort of the Chinese model, but like 10, 15 years behind, any steps that China's doing, but they're sort of following that model. And this slow privatization. But so today what you've got, the system is called, they call it communism with Chinese characteristics, or Marxism with Chinese characteristics. Economists are actually starting to call it market socialism. So I like that word. So it's still socialist, but you have a market economy. So today, you still have overcapacity in state-owned companies. And you still have a significant percentage of the GDP that's attributable to state-owned companies. So the four largest companies in China are banks. They're all state-owned. China now has, let's say, about 100 companies on the Forbes list. And again, also an important point, there's more than one Forbes list. So you might hear there's 100, there's 200. There's one for profitability. There's one for just size. So there's different, because a lot of the SOEs are not that profitable, but they're huge. But anyway, of the, let's say, 100 companies, like 40 of them about are state-owned companies. But then they make it onto the Forbes list for being large. Does that mean they're profitable? Should they maybe cut some employees? And then you wind up with this problem. If I cut the employees, then our unemployment's going to go up. And you're at the state level at that point. The government wants to show low unemployment. The SOEs don't really have to make a profit because companies make profits, give the profits back to the shareholders the government, so they don't really need that. The other thing is that the state-owned companies are given a lot of protection in the economy. So there's a lot of sectors that we call protected sectors, restricted sectors, where foreign companies, but even Chinese companies, are actually not allowed to sell or not allowed to enter into that sector of the economy. So like banking is a heavily protected sector. Defense, obviously, energy, certain areas are just protected. You're not allowed to go in that area. But even as a Chinese company, you're not allowed to open. So what winds up happening is like, okay, if I ask you right now, on your phone, what is the #1 communication tool that you use on your phone?
WeChat.
WeChat. It's literally 100% of the market share is WeChat. So that's what you wind up with in China. You wind up a lot of times that because you have a protected sector, that one company gets 100% of the business of China, and China is the biggest country in the world. So then that company becomes the biggest company in the world in its category. I forgot how many categories right now, but there's a number of categories where the largest company in the world is a Chinese company, and yet if you went on the street in Finland or New York or wherever and asked people, they've never heard of it. I don't know that, like Huawei, I don't know if I walk down the street in Europe, have people heard of Huawei?
Yeah, they heard about it, but
Yeah.
you don't that many
It's
people have
starting
it.
to come to the West.
Yeah.
But the most popular beer in the world is Snow, the Chinese one.
There you go. There you go.
And we don't even know and drinks it here.
Right.
This is the countryside beer.
Yep.
Yeah, not
Yeah,
even.
but there's a lot of people in the countryside.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what you wind up with. So on the one hand, you'll go, oh, China's dominating, the world economically, and all the biggest companies. And you find out, well, 100% of their income is derived in China, and no one outside of China's heard of them, and they're not profitable because they're state-owned enterprises. So so that company, if he's protected by the government, no one else is allowed to enter the sector. If he has 100% of the Chinese market and he doesn't have to make a profit, he does really well. Right? But then if he goes to Europe, he's going to find out it's different. So like even Alibaba is probably, it's one of my favorite Chinese companies, right? Like Huawei, for example, still derives, I think, 80 or 85% of their total revenue is in China. Alibaba is one of my favorite companies. Jack Ma has like the best story. He's probably the closest thing to a Western, I know you don't like my president, but Donald Trump or Richard Branson or famous for just being famous, right? And Jack Ma right now probably makes as much money off of giving speeches and motivational. You could buy the CDs or whatever, play them in your car on the way to work, and you'll be a more productive worker. He's probably making as much of that. So Jack Ma's he's really one of my favorite people. But even Alibaba, and they're fond of telling you, oh, we're in X number of countries. We're in California. We have 4 locations in the U.S. I'm like, yeah, you have research and development centers in the U.S. because that's where you can get the best technology and the best engineers and whatnot. But actually, they're not making any money in the U.S. yet. And Alibaba Amazon was unable to compete with Alibaba in China for any number of reasons. Part of it is, jingoism on the part of my own country, that a lot of times companies from my country are not as in tune with the local culture and they don't understand how to do it. That's part of it, but part of it is that Alibaba just has such a dominance in China that it's very, very difficult to crack. And also they're both working under different rules because the American company or the Finnish company or German company is going to abide by, hopefully, international trade rules. And the Chinese company may not. Things like, I think it ties to what do you call it? Authenticating the brands, knowing that the products are real. The Nikes they're selling are really from Nike and not some company in somebody's house. And so the American companies or foreign companies might have trouble breaking in here, but meanwhile the Chinese companies are not, in general, not doing huge business overseas either. But they're huge in terms of just their total volume of business. So listen, guys, I would like you to ask me questions. Okay, so that's anything you'd like to ask me about. Awesome.
Not yet, I think. They are not yet making a lot of money abroad, but I think many Chinese companies, they are now investing in Southeast Asia, and those countries are growing.
Yeah, so that's good. I'm glad you mentioned Southeast Asia. So that's my other area of research. So my specialty is China outbound investment, and then Southeast Asia is my area of research, and especially ASEAN. Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So the interesting thing about the Chinese model is that they're trading with all these countries that are developing countries. Oh, we're doing this much trade with the country. I'm like, yeah, but you're running a trade surplus with them. So you're going to Laos, you're going to Vietnam, and you're running a trade surplus. Cambodia, they're running a trade surplus with these countries. In other words, they're selling more products to them than what they're importing. Very interestingly, so I was talking to one of my Lao friends the other day, and I said, yeah, I said China is basically, when I was in Laos doing research in 2007, Vietnam dominated them politically and militarily. Thailand dominated them economically, whereby Thailand didn't force anything on them. I mean, they just were trading and selling products. Whereas Vietnam, actually, there was a Vietnam government building in Vientiane that was like double the size of the Lao government building, and there were more Vietnamese soldiers in Lao than there were Laotian soldiers. You know, so it's a different kind of dominance. But I said to him, I said, yeah, China's really dominating Chinese Lao economy now. He goes, yeah. He goes, well, what can we do? They can make products cheaper than we can. The average income in Lao is $120 a month, and still China can make products cheaper than they can. And this is Modi, you know, the Prime Minister of India. This is one of his complaints. He said that on low-end manufacturing, like cheap plastic shower shoes and cheap plastic things for the house, he said China is already driving Indian street vendors out of business because they can produce the products cheaper. That's madness. Like some Indian guy that earns 20 rupees, I don't know how much a rupee is worth, I'm just picking a number, earns 20 rupees a month, pushing a push cart, and the Chinese factory is able to sell cheaper than he can. So I just find that astounding,
But it's not only like labor work you need when you're producing this kind of products. I mean, like it's not nowadays more and more robots.
More and more robots, yeah.
So that's the cheaper, like they have the maybe the very technology here in Laos.
Yeah. That's part of it is the technology. Part of it is the access to raw materials. So when I was telling you about these state-owned enterprises, a lot of Western economists look at China and they go, oh, your state-owned enterprises are not profitable, you got overcapacity, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you cut that and make them profitable? But the purpose of the state-owned enterprise is not necessarily to make a profit. So one of the main areas they work in is acquisition of natural resources, including raw materials and energy. And these are two of the biggest inputs, of course, for making products. So that is something. Can you imagine if the company that brings the like these cheap plastic shower shoes, right? When I buy them in Burma, they're made in China. People in Burma are so poor, you would think they could make it. No, it comes from China. And why? Because the rubber for that product came from state-owned rubber factories over 27, that is able to all the workers are state employees, they don't have to earn a profit, they have complete access to the shipping. It's then shipped by state shipping company number 18, which is fueled by state, fuel company, blah, blah, blah. And when they need money, they borrow from the state bank, and they get soft loans that they don't necessarily have to pay back, right? So they're able to produce things even cheaper than Laos or Vietnam or whatever. I'm sorry, you had a question as well.
I think I had a few. But yeah, one trade policy issue I used to follow was the steel overproduction, just a little bit on it, because European Union is taking kind of stance on that. But the problem is now, I guess, that China is becoming like a full WTO member, so that we can't anymore discriminate the same way against that kind of overproduction and subsidization of producing steel. So now we have to find a different way of calculating where does the competitive advantage come from. This cheap, raw materials, subsidizing energy consumption, all that.
Although those are all of those things are violations of WTO. That's another issue. You're not supposed to have state subsidies, you're not supposed to have soft loans.
Yeah, but I guess the problem is the way to measure it. How can we say it's not market price?
Yep.
Because there is no market.
Yeah. Yep. And also that China alone accounts for so much of the world's use of raw material that essentially China can dictate the price, can't it? for a lot of the, maybe they're using 30% of the world's total volume for raw materials, right? So they can almost dictate the price at that point. And then the other question is, even before they joined the WTO, they stockpiled a lot of things like, and during the household responsibility system, they made this horrible iron. There's this program where they told the villagers, like, you can plant your fields during the day, and at night we'll have somebody come around and teach you how to make iron. And every village like made iron, and it was just the worst, most horrible quality iron that's ever been made, because there's a bunch of farmers who had no idea. They made the ovens out of like mud, like basically, and they burned wood. And in some cases, to meet their production quotas, they broke up the furniture. They burned the wooden parts of the furniture, melted the metal parts of the furniture, and then added it to their iron quota. And then they had no furniture. When the state inspector came in, you have no furniture. Oh, it's okay, we'll go get it from the factory. So they took this horrible steel to the factory, they made terrible furniture and brought it back, and it all fell apart. But a lot of this steel is turning up now in like Africa and different places, like, because they stockpiled it. They've just been sitting on it for 30 years. So, even if they, okay, fine, and now they're happy to comply with the international rules. Okay, we'll sell it at fair market value. You're right. We want to abide by the rules.
So do you think that the Southeast Asian countries, like, what are the benefits for them from the cheap products and the difference of the balance of the trade deficit? I mean, is there advantages? I mean, for sure, China is also pouring money into the countries, right? At least.
Yes and no. So China's pouring money. So if you look at OPOR, right, the One Belt, One Road initiative, now they changed the name to the Belt and Road Initiative. So this affects ASEAN a lot. So this thing, it starts all the way in, Singapore, goes up through Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and into China. So for this project, they're building railroads, they're building highways, they're building fiber optic cables, energy transfer grids, and things like this. So on the one hand, so what are they getting at? So they're getting all this infrastructure upgrade that they couldn't afford otherwise. However, when you say they're pouring money in, they're pouring concessional loans in. And the loans are often at as high as 6%. World Bank loans tend to go, and you work at the MCC, so you probably know this better than me, but
No, I don't.
World Bank loans in the IMF can be as low as 0.25%, up to I think 3.5 or 3.25 is their maximum. So like Sri Lanka is a really good example. Sri Lanka needed infrastructure upgrade, and they went to the World Bank and IMF to borrow money, and the World Bank and IMF said, no, you're already, debt as a percentage of your GDP is already too high. If we loan you more money, it's going to be debt slavery, we're not going to do it. And then their good friend came and loaned them money at 6% and built all this stuff for them. And then when the loan payments came due, they couldn't afford it. So they did what's called asset transfer. So the major port and the major airport in Sri Lanka have both been transferred to a 99-year lease to China. The other one is, the most famous one is one I'm writing about right now. It's Gwadar. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Gwadar port in Pakistan. And this port is really important because the port of Pakistan, one, is one of the largest ports in the world, and number two, it works out perfectly for China because it's the port closest to Iran, which is where China's getting most of their petrol. So if they can own the port, then they can take it through the Silk Road, the new Silk Road up to China, so it's really important for them. And already the loans for building all the infrastructure in Pakistan come due in 2020. I mean, that's not that far. It was 3 years from now. They're going to have to start paying loans. Of course, they're not going to be able to, and they're going to wind up with asset transfer. And now I read something yesterday. They've actually lost control of part of the port already. It's already been transferred.
But I mean, is that a bad thing? I mean, still they have the infrastructure.
Exactly.
I mean, otherwise they wouldn't have built it.
Yep. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to use, I really don't want to make judgments of good and bad. For one thing, I derive 100% of my income from the Chinese government. So, and my research budget. So no, seriously, I'm not in a position to say good or bad. It's not for me to say. What I will say is, now there's a highway that they didn't have, now there's a railroad they didn't have, that's a good thing. The bad thing is now they have massive debt. And the question is, how are they going to pay it? working on something right now about trade deficits. So I'm working on a really big project about trade deficits. So it's easy to look at a trade deficit and say it's bad to run a trade deficit with someone. And right now, when you say you're running a trade deficit with someone, you're running a trade deficit with China. Like, it's unbelievable. Almost every country that trades with China is running a trade deficit with China. And almost every country now, their largest trading partner is China. Certainly for ASEAN and the US, that's the case. So, but it's very easy to just look at it and go, oh, we have a trade deficit with China. And there's this guy on TV, I don't know if you've seen him. This guy goes on TV pretty frequently and says, China, China, China.
He doesn't do that anymore so much.
He doesn't. And honestly though, it's easy to say, right, to look at it and go, oh, we have a trade deficit with China, that's why we have unemployment, trade deficit with China, that's why we have a budget deficit, and all this. I don't necessarily believe that's true, and a lot of economists don't. So I'm actually doing research right now, and we're going to try and prove mathematically whether a trade deficit is good, bad, or indifferent. Right now, with all the research I've done, I don't think you can say a trade deficit is necessarily bad. So the fact that Vietnam runs a trade deficit with China is not necessarily a bad thing. And so if you ask me good and bad, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's still trade, it's still activity. Probably, definitely, more people have jobs than had before. And these cheap plastic things, they're produced in China, and that counts as trade when they're imported to Vietnam or exported to Vietnam from here. But, you know, then it's Vietnamese people that are selling them in the market. You know, and also the people are really poor. So you go to like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, people are actually pretty grateful to be able to buy a cheap plastic product because they had nothing before. You know, I couldn't have shower shoes before. Now I can because they're really cheap because they come from China, you know. And as they move up the value chain, the same way they're going to buy Chinese microwaves when they get to that, you know, level of development, the microwave level of development, you know, Chinese cell phones and computers and things like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is true that they have a trade deficit. It is true that they owe a lot of money.
What do you see at the moment? 'Cause I've heard that a lot of companies are moving production to South to East Asian countries like Vietnam.
Yeah, so the problem with China for foreign companies, there's a lot of problems for which you know probably better than anybody because you're selling equipment here. So you probably hear all the stories. So number one, it is getting more and more difficult even to get the foreign expert visas. I'm changing jobs right now, and I just can't believe how much harder it is now than it was 5 years ago. And that was the plan, though. The long-term plan was bring foreigners in for a while until we can learn how to do their jobs, and then slowly we won't need them anymore. That's becoming difficult. As I said, there's a lot of barriers to entry in different fields. So that's hard for foreign companies. And then wages. And this is something, and Petri's heard me talk about this before, though. China's the second richest country in the world by way of GDP, and yet the average salary in China is under 9,000 US dollars a year. A year. In my country, it's $54,000. You know, in Germany, Norway, I'm sure Finland is in the same band with the rest of Scandinavia, right?
Norway's like 70, 80.
Yeah, Norway's like way higher. Germany's like 50 something.
Similar.
Yeah, similar. You guys be like 50. A bit lower than Germany, but still, it's not going to be. It's not 9. You know, and the other thing is that I've done some research for some companies in Africa, so I had to learn a bit about Africa. There's, I think, 8 countries in Africa with higher per capita income than China. And if you go south of my country, you know the wall? The Mexico wall, everything south of there? Okay, Mexico has always been a country that has some potential. Argentina, Chile, Brazil have potential, but everything in between is sort of like it's just sad. I mean, it's just sad, right? All those countries, average per capita income, still higher than China. I mean, these countries, you know, El Salvador, we couldn't have this meeting in El Salvador because 3 of us would get kidnapped. Okay?
The rest of them would get shot.
Yeah, the rest of us would get shot, and the electricity would go out, so we couldn't film, right? And like, you know, you're talking about some terrible countries, and yet their income is higher than China's, right? So China has this preposterously low average income, and one of the reasons is to keep the manufacturing cheap. So you've got a lot of labor working now. The average, say, a factory worker, 2,500 to 3,500 RMB a month. So 400 to maximum $500 a month, and that's including overtime. Well, that salary, that's a 28-day work month, 28 days a month, and I believe it's a 10-hour day or an 11-hour day. And for that, they're getting about $400, $500. In the U.S., factory worker, and we have very low factory wages, by the way, compared to Japan or Germany, and I believe the average is under $20 an hour. But you put that together, they're earning per week much more than a Chinese factory worker earns in a month. So production's much cheaper here than the U.S. But you go to Laos, and especially Vietnam, $120 a month for a 28-day month. So what's happening right now is that American companies and European companies, Japanese companies also, have all told me, they said, well, we're at a point that the regulatory environment in China is becoming very difficult to do business. As much as the Chinese government's trying to suppress the salaries, they are creeping up. They have to. What can you do? I've lived in Shanghai 5 years, and my rent has increased by, say, 30–40%. And how can you keep the wages the same? Where are these workers going to live? How can they eat? So the wages are creeping up regardless of what anybody does. And a lot of Japanese companies and American companies, European companies have told me, they said, we're right on the cusp. It's basically if the salary goes up like 10% more or 20% more, that's going to be enough that they're going to want to move away and go somewhere else. The problem, though, with going to Vietnam, Burma, so it's the choices that I keep hearing, the two top choices are Vietnam and Indonesia. Places like Burma are, yeah.
What's wrong with Bangladesh?
Well, we're talking about Southeast Asia. Bangladesh, what's wrong with Bangladesh? It's outside of my area of research. As far as staying, one of the problems with Bangladesh, though, is that it's not connected. So if you move to Southeast Asia, it's a huge advantage because you have overland shipping to lots and lots of places. But the problem with going to Southeast Asia is then you don't have reliable infrastructure, you don't have the electricity, you may not have a road. Because in China, for all of its faults, and people complain, but okay, but you got roads, the electricity's always on, the internet's slow, but it works. It's infinitely better. And at the end of the day, even when you complain about the regulatory environment, okay, you're absolutely safe, right? You're not going to get, robbed, and companies don't get suddenly, what do they call it, when the state takes the company, statalized. Like that doesn't happen here. Nationalized, yeah, but that could still happen in like Laos. I could see that happening in Laos. I could have seen that happening in Burma until Aung San Suu Kyi came into power. But so it's still Vietnam. That could still happen in Vietnam. So that's the issue. So companies are looking more and more. They're sending exploratory teams to Vietnam and Indonesia and these places, and they're going, the labor's a lot cheaper, but then we got a lot of other things we got to deal with, and so we may not want to move. And I talked to an automotive company, and he told me, he said, we would love to move. He goes, but you know what it costs to build an automotive factory? So like Japanese garment factories already moved. A lot of them already moved. And because garment factory apparently is just very easy to set up, sewing machines and whatever. It's like apparently relatively easy to just move to Cambodia and set one up, and then the government will say to you, oh, there's no electricity, so you have to put in the electricity yourself. You've got to build the road yourself. But apparently for garments you can do that, but for cars and like big machinery and things like that, it's really difficult. But yeah, we're definitely going to see. And the other thing is China. So it's so as an economist, the way it works is if we go back far enough, right? Our grandparents were hunters and gatherers, right? They were out killing animals and gathering food, right? And then eventually we get to a point where everybody's a farmer, and we call that primary industry, agriculture. And then the next level, secondary industry is where you start having factories. So China went through all these stages, and we all did. It's not that long ago, right? Again, you guys are a bit younger than me, but my grandparents were olive farmers. My grandparents worked on somebody else's land. They were tenant farmers, took the olives to market every morning. It's not that long ago, even in the West, and then you went from there to everybody worked in a factory, you know, and for most of the West, this is like 1950s, and suddenly there's factory jobs, and everybody could buy a house for the first time, you could send their kids to school. It's not that long ago. So China's going through those stages. So what happens is you get to that factory stage, and you can make really good money, but then you max it out once everybody's employed. So when you start out, and most people are in agriculture, agriculture adds very little to your GDP, so your GDP is very low. And you start building factories, and for everybody, every person that leaves the farm only reduces the GDP by this much, but then he goes to work at a factory and he increases the GDP by that much. And then you said robots. So on the farm, as people are leaving, they start mechanizing, they build tractors and things like this. And you get to, like my country, believe it or not, the US is one of the largest agricultural producers in the world. We produce enough food to feed the world 3 times over. And less than 1% of the population works in agriculture. In fact, on your tax forms now, there's not even a box that says agriculture. You have to write in other. You know, and it's all mechanized, and you go to these massive farms, you know, and Germany's kind of like that too. I think, you know, I guess Finland too, probably mostly mechanized farming. Yeah, so you know, it might be 3 or 4 people working on a massive farm. You know, so what happens is your GDP jumps. Take all these people out of the farm, you put them in the factory, your GDP skyrockets, and it keeps doing that until everybody's working in the factory. Okay, now where do we go? We improve the efficiency of the factory. Okay, creep up a little bit, creep up a little bit. Where you make your massive jump again, is you move everybody out of the factory into an office. So you go to most of Europe, right? You've got service economy like we do in the States, right? Germany, you know, I just keep saying Germany because I did my studies in Germany, and I spent 4 years there. So what percentage of the German factory people work in farms? Very little. What percentage in factories? More than the U.S., but still not that much. What percentage are working in IT firms, advertising, you know, all these other services? You know, and if you think of it like this, a factory worker earns, in my country, let's say he earns $28,000 a year. An investment banker earns $150,000 a year. So who's contributing more to GDP? So your GDP jumps when you go to this tertiary. China's problem has been, it's called the middle income trap. If you move everybody from the farm to the factory, your country jumps to a middle income country. You're not poor anymore, middle income, you're doing pretty well. And then you have to make that next step. So Japan did it, right? Like Japan went to the next step. China's having trouble going to the next step. They're stuck, and they're stuck with these people in the factories. If they allow the salary to go up, factories are going to close, these people are going to get unemployed, become unemployed, and there's no place for them to go because the service sector in China hasn't grown enough yet to absorb all those people into it. So, like, I don't know, so you guys in Finland, are any of your grandparents farmers? Your grandparents are farmers?
Well, they were born in a farm, but then they moved to the city and
Yeah.
the rest.
Yeah. And you'll find, you know, when you talk to people from a country that are the same age, they'll have like, you know, similar story, you know, whether or not their grandparents were farmers. Did your parents work in factories? Yeah. See that? So you skipped. You skipped that part. Were your great-grandparents hunter-gatherers? Yeah. So when I worked in I used to be an investment banker in the 90s in New York, and at that time in New York City we had 250,000 manufacturing jobs. The whole city of New York, 250,000 people worked in factories, and today it's you know, probably half of that, right? So you know, you'll just find it. Probably you don't know anybody. Certainly you don't know anybody your age in their 20s who works in a factory. But you know people do.
How much would you still think that, how much in percentage the service industry need to be growing?
Okay.
That
in China.
Yeah. That actually that can take all these factory workers.
Okay. So very good point. So when they made this jump to the factories, they were able to send their kids to university for the first time. Okay. So again, exactly what happened in Finland, but it's just 20, 30, 50, you know, 40 years later, right? China is now graduating almost 8 million. It's over 7 million. It's between 7 and 8 million kids a year graduating university in China. And the service sector would need to grow at a rate of at least that number, at least 7 to 8 million jobs per year to be able to absorb them all. Because you don't graduate university and go work on a farm. You don't graduate university and go work in a factory. So the service sector needs to grow at that rate. And the other
Do
issue.
you have an estimate, like 10%
Yeah.
maybe, or?
We
So
also have a lot of people retiring. I mean, the
Also, but also university people, they go to factories too, but as managers or engineers.
yeah,
But
yeah. But if they go as an engineer, I don't know if that would count as service sector. You know, and that's a very good point too. I don't know. Factory would have an accountant. They'd have a bookkeeper, right? I don't know how you count those. I don't know actually what the number is. In terms of numbers, I know that for one of my research last year, Beijing created, just in the city of Beijing, and created something like 148,000 service sector jobs in 2015. But the problem is that China is not uniformly developed, right? So when they poll university graduates and say, where do you want to work? 60% of them tick these 3 boxes. Service sector, Shanghai first choice, Beijing second. 60% of them. So you're looking at 4 million kids that want to go to Beijing and Shanghai, and Beijing only created 148,000 new service sector jobs. You know, Shanghai, I would assume, is a bit more, but I don't know how many.
can I ask, where do you get your facts usually? Is it
So my main sources of data generally are from IMF, World Bank, the Heritage Project, the U.S. Trade Representative Office, Brookings Institute, all the top. And in fact, any facts I've said tonight, if you need verification or you want, just send me an email and I'll send you actually the actual research papers that I did, and they'll have all the citations in there.
No, just interested as well, like where can I find also similar?
Yeah. The U.S. Trade Representative is awesome. It's part of the State Department, and they do amazing research on trade all over the world, and I love that. And there's one called the Heritage Project that I use a lot. They have this set of like maybe 12 things, 12 indicators. And that's all they do, is they monitor these 12 indicators on every country in the world, and they update it, I guess, monthly or weekly or something. And so I get a lot of data from them. That's really interesting.
So, what's your take on the interior? I mean, economy here in China. I mean, this is like, there's always talk about bubble in the housing sector. No, not infrastructure. I mean, like more of the financial situation. I mean, talk about what is it, shadow banking sector, and how do you see that? I mean,
So,
of course,
before 1978, there was only one bank in China, and most people didn't really have money, right? So you didn't go to the bank and deposit your ration coupons. You know? So when the People's Bank of China became one of the biggest banks in the world, because it was the only one, like everybody had to put their money in. And until very recently, common people had nothing that they were actually allowed to invest in. But meanwhile, the economy was growing. So people were becoming wealthier, they had more money to invest, but they weren't allowed to invest anywhere. And so property became one of the first things that they were allowed to invest in. And even that was, and you're not allowed to own, obviously, land in China, right? But this idea, someone came up with the idea, let's sell apartments, and you can invest in these apartments. So the initial wave of property investing came from parents and grandparents who were sitting on just hordes and hordes of cash. Just there was nothing you were allowed to do with it. And at that time, like even when I lived here in 2003, Chinese people were not in possession of their passport. They just passed a new law that if you were a businessman, and I don't know how they quantified that you're a businessman, if you were a businessman, you were allowed to have your passport at your house. But other people, you might not be allowed to have a passport at all, and other people was like, I guess a state office held it for you, and if you had to go out of the country, you went there, and I guess you justified why you were going, and they gave you your passport, and then you, I guess, gave it back. Like the athletes, would have had that. They still do at the sports university. Those guys don't have their passports. Somebody's holding it. When they go out of the country, they go, sign for, I'm going here, and here's the document. Anyway, so they weren't allowed to invest abroad. There was no stock market, so they invested in housing. And that's what caused the housing bubble. As we're moving forward, then there was the stock market bubble because the government started going on TV telling people to invest in the stock market because it's safe and you make lots of money, right? And so the Shanghai stock market just just exploded. And then of course it's the most volatile stock market in the world. It's like 80% more volatility than the New York Stock Exchange, just these crazy ups and downs. So to answer your question, so one of the issues is you get a lot of people sitting on a lot of cash, and that causes these bubbles to happen.